right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Mark Vlossak at St. Innocent Winery, the new St. Innocent Winery. It's Thursday, May 30th, 2019. Thanks so much for joining us, Mark. We're going to start you off by asking, why wine? What got you into wine?
Well, I was blessed that my dad offered me a glass of wine when I was about 7 years old. He thought that it would be good to teach essentially responsible drinking habits in much the same way that it's done in Europe. My father had Hungarian parents, my mother had Italian parentage. They both immigrated to this country. And he basically said to me, you know, in Europe, children get a glass of wine with meal, that's something that's part of a meal. It's not for the alcohol, it's for the fact that it's a beverage, of community beverage that is, has a long tradition for thousands of years of accompanying a meal, and that he wanted me to have the option to enjoy that at dinner. And so he poured me a glass of wine, and it turned out that I hated it. And I said, "What is this?" Because I noticed that he wasn't drinking that wine. And I asked him for what he had, and he gave me what he was drinking. And I said, "Oh, that's really interesting. I like that." And it turned out that what he had given me was Mogan David, because I was first time it was Mogan David because I was a sugar addict when I was a kid, and spent all my money on candy that I made in my allowance. He thought that I would like it, and I'm not sure what exactly he was drinking, but it was probably Puy Fusé that no kid in the right mind would like. And I was like, this is great, I love this. And my dad's kind of was like, this kid likes wine. And basically I started enjoying wine at dinner, and he went from not knowing anything of wine from about 2 years before I started tasting wine, to having an importer's license, to being one of the early members of the Society of Wine Educators. He was in the first group of, when the Society of Wine Educators created their certificate, he was in the first group of 17 to pass that exam.
Wow.
He was the first American, not the first person, but the first American to get their Lifetime Achievement Award. And he basically had an importer in Wisconsin, where I grew up, bought him an importer's license because he knew more than anybody in the guy's staff. So he would send my dad to France and shove him all the lists and decide what to buy. So for 20 years, my dad had an importer's license as a hobby. You know, he was a metallurgist in the paper industry. That was his real job. And essentially, I grew up drinking everything. I mean, stuff that you think, how could you even, afford that? An example, so I was 7 in 1959. So when the Bordeaux's came out in 62 from the 59, which was considered, it had not been for 61, it probably still would have been one of the vintages of the century. But he bought all of the Premier Grand Cru Bordeaux's in half bottle, full bottle, and Magnum. And the highest bottle price was for Lafite, and it was $7.25 a bottle. So it was kind of a different world back then. You could really enjoy and buy amazing wines that you could actually still afford. I mean, it was still, 30 times the price of a loaf of bread. But if you could buy Premier Grand Cru Bordeaux for 30 times the cost of a $4 loaf of bread, people would buy it all the time. It's gone up 10 times beyond that at least. So I basically grew up drinking wine and enjoying wine. And my mother, about that same time, started studying with a French chef, actually a master chef from the Cordon Bleu in Wisconsin, who trained chefs out of her house, which was in Fond du Lac. Her name was Madame Cuny, Kuony. And in the Milwaukee Public Market, the test kitchen is named after Madame Cuny. She's kind of a culinary legend in Wisconsin. And my mother just studied with her for fun for 10 years on and off. Not to be a chef, just... So my mother went from a very ordinary cook, my dad went from a martini drinker, to, eating unbelievable food and drinking insane wine, and basically growing up way pre-adolescence doing that. So that's really what where everything comes from. You know, for a lot of people, they start drinking wine, you know, when they're at the end of their adolescence. And we all know that you learn things differently pre-adolescence and so I kind of grew up having an understanding with wine, and essentially the most important thing that I have really is this food and wine natural training you know, environment that I grew up in, and that's really more important than anything else. I mean, it isn't that hard to learn to make wine. It's very hard to understand what kind of wine you want to make, and then make decisions to essentially achieve that goal. Well, I had a goal. I knew what I liked. I knew I had a palate. I always thought about it in terms of food, so my wines have always been about eating, not just drinking. And that has continued for all of these years. So fast forward, my first career was as a theatrical designer. I went to Madison, graduated from Madison, worked on the East Coast in New York and Boston and Cape Cod, and then I came back and decided that living out of a suitcase wasn't for me, and essentially finished pre-med and did some cancer research, and then went to Colorado and studied as a physician assistant in the only pure pediatric program in the country. Graduated in 1980 from that program and finished the last 3.5 months of my internship in Oregon. 3 weeks at the high-risk nursery in Portland at Best Kaiser, and then the last 3 months in a private practice in Salem, and basically just said, you know, I love it, I'm never leaving. That was right before the volcano blew, and that didn't scare me away. And I started drinking Oregon wine in 1980. And I didn't really understand how young the industry was in 1980. I mean, I went to California and saw all these places in California, and Napa and Sonoma and, you know, the Central Coast, and, you know, visited wineries and visited Oregon wineries. Thinking back, I mean, David Adelsheim hadn't released the Pinot Noir in 1980. And you think about David as being here forever. You know, the first Irie Pinot Noir was released in '73. So there had been 7 vintages of Pinot Noir ever when I moved to the state and started drinking wine. By '83, which was one of the really early great vintages, was my oldest daughter's, my first daughter's birth year. So I bought a bunch of '83s to commemorate her birth year, and just kept drinking. It also turned out in '83 that before she was born, that we had a 2-income family with no kids, and we were both in the medical field, so we had money, and I was drinking a lot of champagne and some California champagne, but a lot of champagne, and really enjoying it. And in Bon Appetit there was an article, I think it was in the March issue, 1983, and Andrei Chelishev was quoted in this article about American sparkling wine as saying that the greatest sparkling wine in America would be made in Oregon, not California, because Oregon was the place to grow the grapes of Champagne, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And I literally read the article and said, I'm going to do that. And I don't know where it came from. Never thought about being a winemaker before. And after that moment, I really didn't think about anything else. And so then the question was, you know, I had all this science, I had a master's degree in pediatrics, I had taken botany classes in college, you know, I knew medicine, I knew arts, I knew construction, I knew, you know, I'd been a theatrical designer, I built sets, I was a master electrician in the theater. I had a lot of skills that were helpful, but I didn't know anything about making wine, and I went to started taking classes, and one of the classes was from a very well-known microbiologist, wine chemist, named Lisa Vandewater, who had a laboratory in Napa called the Wine Lab, and she was coming up to Oregon and teaching classes about microbiology and fixing problematic wines and things like that. And I said to Elisa, you know, I want to be a winemaker. What should I do? Should I go to Davis? You know, I've already got a master's degree, but I guess I could get another one, you know. And she said, well, how much wine do you want to make? And I said, you know, I don't know, 6,000 cases, something like that, you know, maybe. And she was like, well, go to Davis if you want to make more than 100,000. But if you don't want to make that much wine, I can teach you the laboratory stuff. You can take extension courses and learn the other stuff. But what you should really do is go and work for somebody that's doing what you want to do, about that size. Mm-hmm. That's how you should learn. And I said, okay. So in the summer of 1987, I went to visit Fred Arterberry in McMinnville, right across the street from David Lett's winery. Mm-hmm. Fred was David Lett's first cellar master, and his winery was built across the street, and Arterberry Limited was the first Oregon producer of sparkling wine. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, I should start from the beginning. Little did I know at the time that he was also basically one of the first people to make single vineyard Pinot Noir from vineyards that weren't his own, because he didn't have any vineyards. He made Marsh, which was then called the Red Hills Vineyard, and Art Weber's Vineyard, which is close to Goldschmidt, and he made 2 single vineyard Pinot Noirs. And then about the time I started working with him, Freedom Hill came in production, and Freedom Hill rapidly became his largest source of grapes. Fortuitously, or somewhat interestingly anyway, mm-hmm. It's also my biggest source of grapes now, after 30 some years after that. So I went to work with Fred thinking he can teach me about sparkling wine. It ended up that I also had this fabulous education on Pinot Noir. And he's probably, you know, one of the first people to make really distinctive terroir-specific wines, long before me or Ken Wright or Patty Green, or, you know, a lot of us that do this mm-hmm. same thing now. But he started way back in the 70s doing this, you know. So I did work for a summer with Lisa Vandewater, and she did train me about the lab before I started. I took a bunch of extension courses at Davis. I worked with Fred for 2 years, apprenticed with him for 2 years. And in '88, I did my first vintage at Arterberry. I did 10 tons of fruit. I made a sparkling wine, a Pinot Noir from Seven Springs, because they were my friends. That was one of the second or third vintage they had fruit out of Seven Springs. Mm-hmm. And then I made Chardonnay from Seven Springs. There was a crop failure that year, so I didn't get enough Pinot Noir to make even the 7 barrels that I ended up making. So I got some fruit from a vineyard in South Salem that was owned by Bill Nisbet, Dr. Bill Nisbet. Mm-hmm. And blended it with the Seven Springs. But I did make single vineyard Chardonnay from Seven Springs in '88. And then it started to grow. Of course, I had no money. I started the business with nothing by today's standards. Couldn't even buy a wine press for the money I started this winery with. I basically sold stock to friends and family, and said, you're going to lose your money because this is a winery and nobody makes any money in the wine business. And they were like, yeah, well, we still want to play this game with you. And I essentially made a deal that said, if I'll buy in at this X amount, I'll work for 5 years for free. Not really for free, but for no cash. Right. I'll work for stock. If at the end of 5 years, I'll either have something, I'll have been successful, or you'll have wine that you can sell and make up for your investment, and you'll get paid off when we close the business down. But if I can make this work, at the end of 5 years, I'll own 51% of the company. So that's what I did, and the stock's now worth like 12.5 times what they paid for it, and they're very happy. And I was wrong; they didn't lose all their money.
Nice to be wrong sometimes.
Yeah, that's nice. That's the one nice thing. And we've lost about half of those original stockholders, and gained one person. And we continue to this day with essentially the same group of investors who are very divergent, One's a guy that owns a bunch of auto companies. One's a very well-known agricultural kind of an innovator. One's an assistant attorney general that was a really good friend of mine. My dad has passed away, so I ended up getting his stock. And tech guy in California are kind of the major players. And it works. You know, they've called me when I needed to be called, and they were helpful when I needed help. It's been a really good relationship. So essentially, I didn't have any money to buy vineyards, and way back in the early days, most of the wine made in Oregon was made from purchased grapes. It wasn't sort of the Bordeaux or even the California model where you bought a piece of land, you grew grapes, and you made estate wine. Back when I started, the statistics, if I remember them correctly, was that 80% of the wine in Oregon in the late 80s was made from purchased grapes. And that still today, the most famous vineyards in Oregon don't have wineries associated with them, or didn't in the beginning and then built a winery and still sell fruit. So, you know, Freedom Hills never had a vineyard. If you believe the Wine Enthusiast article, when they picked the Willamette Valley as their wine region of the year 3 years ago, they basically wrote an article, big article, like 10 pages, called 5 Great Oregon Vineyards. And at the end of the article, it says the only winemaker that makes wine from all 5 is Mark Vlossak at St. Innocent. And one of those was what used to be my estate at Zenith, which was originally O'Connor Vineyard, which is actually the first single vineyard Pinot Noir I ever made. I expanded from Seven Springs and picked up O'Connor in 1989, and the first wine I made from that vineyard got a gold medal in the State Fair and was picked up when Lionel Nelson had just opened their wine shop in their summer newsletter, and was featured in a little box that said, essentially, I think the title was, "It's Not Just for Breakfast Anymore," which I still to this day have no idea what that meant, but it was extremely successful. They sold a third of my production of that wine in 5 weeks, and I all of a sudden became, you know, a Pinot Noir producer in Oregon. Some hack that just got lucky or something, I don't know, but it was lovely. Jim Clendenin actually came up to judge for that state fair, went back to California and told everybody, Jim from Au Bon Climat, that this guy in Oregon was making really good wine and should be paid attention to. So it was really kind of an amazing start. I mean, I really, you know, I don't know. I mean, I remember Pierre Rovani, who reviewed Oregon for The Advocate for 10 years, would just say, I don't know how the hell you can make this wine, but I'm glad you're making it, you know. And I don't know either. I chalk it up to, you know, why are some chefs just great? I mean, was it because they trained? It was just because, you know, why do some people play the violin at 5? You know, why can people write music? Why are some people can paint beautifully? I can't paint at all. I mean, I've tried, and I'm terrible, you know. I'd love to be able to paint, you know. I think that some people just have certain skills, and I had no idea that I had this skill. I just made a commitment to make wine just because I wanted it. I just felt driven to do it, you know. It seemed like it just literally was, I call it my moment of insanity. I went from being mostly sane to mostly crazy at literally reading one article one day. It happened in that moment. I didn't think about it anymore. I just did it. And the result is 31 years now of wine.
Amazing.
So,
how did you get from getting started, finding investors, to your original property out with Zenith Vineyard there? How did that come to fruition?
So the original first vintage was made at Arterbury. I wanted to be able to say on the label that it was bottled by St. Innocent. So we needed my own building. Otherwise I'd have to say in those days that it was bottled at Arterbury. So I invested in a multi-use warehouse in South Salem, out by the airport, that was being constructed essentially. So I leased the last stall. There was like 6 warehouses in a row, and modified it so that I could get the Department of Agriculture approval, and moved all the stuff there right before harvest of '89, and then bottled the first Chardonnay, and then did the second vintage there. So that was my little warehouse. It was the 36 feet square, so it wasn't very big, and did 2 harvests in that space. And I had made an arrangement with the owner that when we built it, the next 36 square foot space was available to me after 2 years. We actually framed up a 10-foot square opening in the wall, drywalled over it, put a little nails in the corner, and in 2 years I expanded to the other place, and I just took a skill saw and just went and down came the wall, and I had twice the space. So I ended up staying there 5 years, and at that point we had grown to about 10 times what we originally started doing, and needed more space, and we were selling wine, and it was, you know, it was reasonably successful. Decided we wanted our own place, so I went looking, and I found an industrial park out by where Capital Chevrolet is in the Home Depot, off of Salem Parkway, and bought almost an acre, and basically designed kind of a building like an Oregon barn with a big peak in the center and then sheds off both sides, about 5,000 square feet, much bigger than what we had before, obviously, and got a contractor to build it. We built it in 5 weeks. Unbelievable. Not sure how that happened. And moved the operation there for the 1994 harvest. That summer, so that's basically where we did the next 13 years. That summer, while we were building that, I was approached by Ron Kaplan, who had bought Panther Creek from Ken Wright. And he said, I bought this winery, I need a winemaker, I don't want to miss a vintage, I love your wines, will you make my wine for me? And I was like, it's going to cost you. And he's like, that's okay. So I said, okay, I'll sign up for 1 year, I'll make your wine so you don't lose, and you can figure out what you want to do after that. So I also, while I was building that winery, went into the McMinnville power plant where Ken Wright had bought that 1 square block where the old power plant was, and looked at it and said, I can't make wine here. It's got no insulation. It's hotter than hell in the summer, and it's freezing cold in the winter. And I don't want to make wine in little bins. I make wine in tanks. I want more volume. I want more heat. And Ron was like, do what you need to do. So not only did I build the winery, my second winery, that summer, but I completely redid that building, and also then did harvest for Panther Creek in 1994. Luckily, it was a crop failure year, so I guess that's not really lucky, but it was. And so the total for both wineries was about what I was planning to make at St. Innocent. So it was mostly just getting these 2 things done. I look back at it, I think, I have no idea how I accomplished that. I mean, it was crazy, but I did it. So that was the second phase. I ended up staying with Panther Creek for 5 years, hired Michael Stevenson. He was working at the Golden Valley. He'd done 1 harvest for Flynn, and then worked in Golden Valley, and I hired him as full-time cellar master, and basically trained him. He became assistant winemaker, and then became winemaker after when I walked away and stayed as a consultant for a couple of years. So basically Michael took over the winemaking. So continued in that venture for 13 years, first 5 also at Panther Creek, but then the next 8 just doing that. Grew up to about 6,500 cases, and by that point was selling the wine I made and had some money, and I'd always really wanted to grow grapes. I just didn't have the resources or anything else, you know. So, but I had money at that point, and I was like, okay, how about if what can I buy? Buy some land and I can grow some grapes, because I knew that terroir-specific wines were important, and I would never stop making wine from multiple vineyards, which has become kind of my signature at that point. But I just wanted to get my hands. I wanted, what the French would call, I wanted to be a real vigneron. A vigneron doesn't define a difference between grape grower and winemaker. In France, they have enologists, who are people that sit in laboratories and do analysis, and lots of vignerons have enologists that they consult with. So they're not so much about the chemistry analytical side, they're more about the making, the craftsmanship, and the grape growing. Well, I had worked in a lab, so I already was doing all the analysis, but I really wanted to get my hands into the ground. And I looked for a bunch of places, and basically everything that I looked at fell through. Couldn't find anything. And one of my customers, in the middle of this period, so 1994 through 2006, in the middle of this period, a customer of mine had approached me and said, I want to get involved in the wine business. And he had this, he was living in Chicago. He was a very good customer, and he loved the wines from O'Connor Vineyard, which is now Zenith. And he approached me with an idea, and I said, I don't think that's a good idea. And he said, well, what do you think I should do then? And I said, well, you've always loved the wines from this vineyard, and Pat O'Connor's wife has passed away. He's heartbroken. He doesn't want to be there anymore, and it's for sale. He's asked me to buy it. He asked David Adelstein to buy it, but I didn't, that was too much. It's big, over 133 acres, and it had about 40 or 50 acres of vines in it, and I was just like, no, I can't do that. I said, if you really want to get involved in the wine business, come and buy this vineyard. You love it. And in 2001 he came, and indeed fell in love with it. His wife fell in love with it and bought it. So after 5 years of that, he realized that, as we all know, there's no money in the wine business, that the only way he was going to really make money was to find some alternate source of income. And he and his wife, and he thought the idea of building an event center, which basically didn't exist in Oregon, was a really good idea. And he has this beautiful piece of property with a beautiful view and vineyards and hills surrounding it. And he thought, I'll build this event center, but essentially didn't have any money. He'd spent all his money on, the vineyard was one of the original phylloxera sites in Oregon, and it was being replanted, and was very expensive to do that. So one day I just happened on the idea of, well, what would it take? What do you want? And what would I get if I was that person that invested? And we sat out at Starbucks in South Salem one morning, and in 2 hours basically came up with a deal. So I became the investor, then got a percentage of the whole property and of this minority interest, but an interest in it. And then we decided to rewrite because it's an LLC, the operating agreement, to allow me to essentially build my own building on that property. And own the asset independently, so I could depreciate the asset, and that the winery would continue to be mine. So I was essentially an investor in Zenith, but they were not investors in St. Innocent. I maintained the same group of stockholders. And so in 2006 we wrote that, I made that investment and started planning the building. And in 2007 we finished the building, the winery part of the building, in time for harvest, and in 2008 their event center opened. So then I thought, okay, I've got an estate now. But the reality is, it came clear to me over a period of years that, Tim essentially ran the vineyard. He had a crew of, around 9 guys that were full-time. I wasn't out driving a tractor. We talked about what to do, but I wasn't really doing it. But then I grew, because the idea was that I would keep the vineyards I had and then add the Zenith estate. Well, that brought my production from 6,000 up to close to 10,000. And we all know what happened in 2008. I grew to really poor choice. Not what you call a good venture capital investment. And so we grew and the economy fell apart. And so we weathered that. We sold the wine we made, but it was not easy. One of the reasons I did that is because I basically had no real tasting room, because most people, when they go to wine country, don't drive into an industrial park between Salem and Kaiser and drive past auto dealerships and say, "Oh, look, I'm in wine country." They don't do that. And one of the hopes was that by moving to wine country, that we would have a more vibrant tasting room business. So we had built a tasting room on that property as part of the winery, and we hoped to grow that business. Well, that part of the investment was wildly successful. The building that we built, which was a 4-level gravity winery, was fabulously successful. It was an absolutely wonderful place to make wine. All of that worked out really well. The growth at the wrong time, that was more stressful. At the end of 2000 and in the fall of 2017, a number of things happened that all happened at basically the same time. One was that my daughters, who had all said, "We want nothing to do with this," it turned out that my youngest daughter, who had actually been making wine with me for years, 5 years, I found out what she really didn't want was the very complicated relationship I had at Zenith. Because in Oregon law, it was essentially one big mortgage. And so we were all guaranteeing each other's investments, and that was complicated. It was bigger than what she wanted to take control of. It was just big and kind of complicated. But I thought that she just wasn't interested. When I found out that it was really this kind of overgrown business that I created, that was really the problem. I went to her, and actually to her and my middle daughter, and said, "Well, what if we downsized? What if we sold this investment here and built something that was smaller, that was more efficient, had less wines, back kind of where we were when we were at the other industrial park, like 6,000 cases. Would you be interested then?" And to my great surprise, my middle daughter, who literally had nothing ever to do with the winery, said, "Well, I don't want to make the wine, but I'll run the business." And my young daughter looked at her and said, "Well, I don't want to run the business, but I'll make the wine." And it was like the seas parted and the light shone, and I was like, "Oh, wow." And so I approached my partners and said, "This is what I'd like to do." And kind of amazing in partnerships, between me approaching them and between them buying me out, was less than 3 months. They're like, "Amazing. Let's just make this happen." It was insane. It was so graceful. What then happened was, what was I going to do? And at that point, I started looking at my options. I was like, well, I'm going to keep 4 contracts: Shea, Momtazi, Freedom Hill, and Temperance Hill. They're all long-term contracts. They're basically all block-by-block contracts. I make fabulous wine from them. We're calling now the heritage vineyards. That will continue as long as it can possibly continue, hopefully way past the next generation. So I didn't really need more Pinot Noir. I didn't really need more anything. I just was like, okay, what's the best thing? And I thought, well, my commute is 40 minutes each way, because I live essentially over that hill. It's about 3 miles as the crow flies from here. I was driving to the opposite end of Salem, over the bridge, as far as you could get on the other side of Salem, and still have a Salem address. We really could not go half a mile in either direction and still have a Salem address. And I was like, this is ridiculous. So we started thinking, well, maybe we should build something out, just to build a winery, you know. And I remembered that in 2006, one of my stockholders, Rob Miller from Mount Jefferson Farms, had asked me to come to this property and look at it to see if it was appropriate. He was growing poplar trees on it, those fast growing, like some of these that you see out here. These trees that grow really fast, like in 7 or 8 years, you can harvest them for pulp. So it was a tree farm, but it was completely covered with trees. You couldn't see any of what you can see now. Couldn't see any of it. And he'd logged it in 2005 or 2006. I mean, 2016, he had logged it. And so in 17, I was driving by and I thought, well, let me look at that again. And drove out here, looked at it and thought, this is pretty interesting. And then called Mimi Castile, who's a very good friend of mine and an absolutely brilliant viticulturist. One of these people who found, you know, her way. She was a forestry major, and then her family was in vineyards, and she wasn't going to do it. Then she got involved, and she's amazing. She has this feel. And I said, well, I know that I have a feel because I picked all these vineyards back when no one knew who they were. Seven Springs, Freedom Hill, you know, all these vineyards. I mean, I made the first real vintage of Shea in 1994, the first real crop, and that was also a crop failure year in 94. So they made, you know, it was like 5 barrels of wine from, you know, 2 or 3 acres of grapes. But I don't trust, somehow I just didn't feel comfortable. So I brought Mimi out here. We walked up that ridge and down through the ravine and back up here and around to the top. And I said, I'm thinking about buying this. What do you think? And she got to the very top, this really beautiful view up there. And she said, I think it's possible that the grapes you grow here will be probably the best fruit you get from anywhere. Wow. And I'm thinking, I have some pretty good fruit. Like, are you crazy? I didn't say that to her. I just said, oh, how nice, you know. And so I told Rob, okay, I want Vicki Ann to come and look at this because my wife runs the whole direct sales side of it, and obviously I'm not going to make this kind of a move without her. So she came out with Rob, and we looked at the little cabin. Rob had some employees that were living there. We looked at the little cabin, the log home, which he'd built, basically not built as, it was a home, a residence for tax purposes, but he basically built it as a small conference center. So it's essentially all open except for one bedroom or office upstairs. Otherwise, it's just an open layout. And we walked around and looked at it, and she was not revealing at all in the conversation. So we had all this discussion, and she looked at all this stuff, and we got in the car, and I looked at her and said, what do you think? Having no idea what she was thinking. And she looked at me, she said, well, you know, it's a business decision that you'd have to make because you know the business and you know what you need to do and you know if it'll work or if it won't work. I don't know anything about growing grapes and about wineries, but she said, but if you want to do it here, I'm 1,000,000% behind you. And it was like, so literally from the moment in the end of September when I found out the kids were interested to December 19th when I basically got the money, on January 9th I closed on this property.
Amazing.
And started planting. And basically, although I wasn't really, I didn't really need a lot of acres under the Oregon law. I had to put 15 acres of grapes in order to get a building permit. And it turns out that when we cleared what we had 15 acres. That was it. That was really good grape ground. So it was basically out of the 47.55 acres that's here, there was 15 acres of really interesting hillside ground that we could plant with grapes, and so we set about clearing it. And I basically, in December, designed the winery in 2 days and built a model of it, and the model is exactly what this is. I took it to the architect, I said, this is what I want you to build. And the only thing that changed from the model, not the space, but the way the tasting room in the kitchen lays out, a very good French chef friend of mine in Salem, Bernard Malherbe, basically said, "No, you must not do this. This will not work. This is how you have to lay it out." He was sick in bed, and he said, "Come over here now. We have to talk." And I went over, and only as a mad Frenchman, he was like, in his bathrobe, and he got out his paper, and he said, "No, you must do this, and you must..." And that's basically the tasting room and kitchen that we built. The space is the same, but how it was laid out. And that's basically what we built. I knew where I wanted it. The only thing we did is we moved it 10 feet farther down the hill. Other than that, this was exactly what I envisioned, what I laid out. I brought a friend over from Zenith, the guy that ran the crew, and we rented a track hoe and a big loader, and we basically started digging out the hillside to try to figure out where it would be, and then very quickly realized that this was a job for professionals and that we were not professionals after 2 weeks of digging and not getting very far. And so basically so I used CD Redding, which was the people that built Zenith, and said, "Will you build me my new winery?" And they were like, "We'll do anything you want us to do." And I was like, "I want you to build this winery," and we built it. And basically, it's fabulous. It's about 2/3 the size of what we had at Zenith. The tasting room is more than twice as big. The really important part that we had realized at Zenith was that the time when people want to come to wineries is weekends in the summer. Having a wedding venue at Zenith, when people want to get married, are weekends in the summer. So we were very limited what we could do outside, because outside was a little patio and a 100-car parking lot. And all these people coming in on Saturday and Sunday and Fridays to go to a wedding, and not to come. You thought there would be some over, but people don't go to a wedding to buy wine or to pay for a tasting at a winery. They go to a wedding for free wine. That's what you get at a wedding. Get free alcohol and dancing, and that's a party, you know. So what I really wanted was an opportunity for customers to be able to come here and just hang out. I mean, I don't go to wineries and sit at a bar and taste. I don't like to do that. I like to go taste with winemakers and hear stories, but I don't really like to just go like, here's your 5 wines, get the hell out. It wasn't interesting to me. So I knew that when I was deciding this, that I needed it to be a place where you could look like at this beautiful pond and the 2 ravines, and have this outdoor space where people could do a tasting at the bar if they wanted. But they could also just buy a bottle of wine, and we would offer food, because it was always about food. We were always known as the winery that did all these fancy open house food offerings. And the idea was that we could integrate with the overhead doors, that we could integrate inside and outside as the seasons dictated. We could have an overflow onto the crush pad, which at Zenith was just full of wine and crap. But here we were like, we're going to make this so in the winter we can just take up an overhead door, and we've got another 1,000, 2,000 square feet just of space out there to just hang out, where people can come in the winter, and we can do all kinds of food events. And we would put our own commercial kitchen in, so we could do food and wine pairings, which is allowed under the law, not a restaurant. And we didn't want to be a restaurant. We didn't want to do weddings. We just wanted for people to be able to come and have an experience. And so the whole design of this and how it lays out over the pond with this beautiful hill and all this gorgeous view was really all about integrating this experience. And continue to make wine like as we had, with gravity into the tanks, gravity bottling, underground barrel room, naturally temperature controlled, naturally all that stuff we brought. We just built it in a more compact and much more integrative visual. If you go up in the field and you look, the dirt is the same color as the roof. And the roof slopes down. It's cut out almost to the ground in the back. So it's just and from the freeway, the angle of the roof is exactly the visual angle to the freeway. So you basically hardly see the roof. And the idea was to make it just that sort of the idea that I'm not here to dominate this space, and I'm here to be a partner with nature. So essentially, one of the things we did is we left the oak trees through this vineyard and in the other vineyard. We didn't take the oak trees out. We trimmed them up higher. We took out the conifers, which essentially kill the oak trees. We did that, but we left the oaks. We left the ravines naturally. We didn't take them out. We didn't fill them in. We didn't move dirt around. We basically left the nature and built within it. And the idea was that the whole experience would be that kind of integrative experience, and that we would grow grapes in that same way. So we don't use any pesticides. We don't use any herbicides. We're doing essentially no-till, or kind of management. Mimi is very helpful, and hopefully will continue to be very helpful, because I'm not an expert. And not only did I get a winery in the setting I wanted, 4 or 5 minutes from my home, that is beautiful and lovely to be, that I now own with my wife and the small group of investors, and my kids are interested in taking over it. But now I'm driving the tractor, and I'm putting the plants in, and I'm just digging trenches and putting in drip for the last parts up there, because we had a terrible drought year and we lost half of our plants that we put in last year. So we replanted 50%. And it turns out that I'm digging back there, and it's been raining all spring, and I'm digging down 3 feet to add some drip pipes, and the soil is dry, 3 feet down. I'm like, it's been raining all winter. How is this soil dry? So clearly there's not a lot of water here. These vines are going to have to work their way down, and so I can not have to rely on this. But after all that loss, it's like I'm putting in drip. Luckily I have water here that I can do that with. So, my goal, smaller, more compact, go from 7 vineyards down to 4, 6 Pinot Noirs down to 4, 3 white wines down to 2. Something that's where I'm involved in the land, in all the decisions. My hands are working the soil. I mean, it's every dream that I've imagined, that all just came true in the last year and a half, and I feel extremely blessed.
Incredible. It's an incredible amount of kismet. And it's amazing property, and amazing design here, so it's very awesome. I want to back up a second. You mentioned when you very first started, you wanted to name your wine St. Innocent. You wanted to say Bottled by St. Innocent. So that was a name you had chosen early on. What's the genesis of the name?
I wanted to thank my dad and name the winery after him. So my dad's name is John, as far as I knew, was John I. Vlossak. And as far as anybody knew, because his middle name was Innocent and he hated it. He never told anybody that his middle name was Innocent. The only reason I knew is I was putting his socks away, and at the bottom of his sock drawer was his Social Security card. It's very interesting. I had to get a replacement Social Security card a while ago, and when the Social Security card, it said, "Put this in a safe place, do not carry it in your wallet," like at the bottom of your sock drawer. And I thought, what's the odds of that, So I ruled out John's Winery, because that doesn't really cut it. And Vlossak Winery sounds like a pickle company. I didn't really want that association. And so I thought, Innocent, what can I do with that? And it was about the time that a lot of California wineries, and actually Oregon and Idaho, were Saint something. So Saint Michel, Saint Chapelle in Idaho, Saint Supéré in Napa, already had Saint Jean. And I just thought, Saint Innocent, everybody can spell it. Nobody can spell Vlossak. Pretty much everybody can spell Innocent anyway. And I did a trademark search, and there was no St. Innocent Winery. So it's like, okay, that sounds good. So I actually didn't tell him. I actually had been making some homemade sparkling wine since '85. I disgorged some of it, had a friend mock up the label, which is basically the label we still have, and labeled up this and sent a case to my dad. And then I sent him a prospectus. I said, this is what I'm doing. And he then would, many years, he would come. He worked harvest with me until he couldn't work it anymore. He would come when we had wine club events or open houses, and his name tag said, John, quote, Innocent Vlossak. And he would say, "I'm John Innocent. The winery is named after me." He was very proud. So it was a very nice way to say thank you. So that's how it got its name.
That's awesome. It's a great story. You also you mentioned at the original winery, and now at this site, you've gone with the gravity flow natural. Tell me about why you chose to go that way, and why you chose to stay with that when you were redesigning here.
So one of the things that, when I started early on, started studying and getting the idea, I started, like the first Cool Climate Symposium ever was in 1983, and I went to it. And there was a lot of discussion among the early winemakers about why the Pinot Noirs were the way they were, and what it was that people were doing experiments. That's the innovative, inquisitive, cooperative attitudes that still are a huge part of why Oregon is what it is, especially the Willamette Valley is where it is that people ask questions about everything. And one of the things that I remember, there was a research that was done on destemmers. There was an Italian destemmer that everyone used, and the wines had really hard tannins. And one of the people got the idea that the must pump in the bottom of this was just chewing up the grapes and breaking seeds. So did a modification, taking the must pump out of it, so that it would just kind of pour out, picking it up, basically putting, gravitating it in. And I remember, and I don't remember who it was, but I remember that the research basically said that the wines changed enormously just by taking out this little pump. And it made me very aware that how you handle Pinot Noir had a huge effect on the kind of wine that you made. And these things have been used in California with no problem for Cab and Syrah and everything else that they were doing. But in Oregon with Pinot Noir, it didn't work at all. And it made me really start to say the paradigm for Pinot Noir is inherently different than it is for what normally we make in the United States. And that the way we handle things is really important to the kind of wine we make. So, the second vintage, I had no money. But I knew I wanted to buy temperature-controlled fermenters. I wanted a refrigeration system. I wanted a must pump like Fred had, which is it's called a Moino style. It's a progressive cavity pump that's very delicate. And I knew I wanted a really good destemmer, like that would give me whole berries, and I could control, all of this stuff. I didn't have any. I had a one-story warehouse for the first two buildings. But after 17 years of that, I was like, if I'm going to build a winery, I'm going to build a winery that takes out this must pump, because as gentle as it, in fact, I can control it, and it's all I control the speed and everything, it still is another step that things go wrong. And I, instead of sort of going to high-tech stuff, like some other wineries, like, built machines that drop stuff in, I was like, if I just use gravity and I just build a building that goes downhill, I can do my processing up here and just drop it in the tank. And if I basically put a removable railing in above all these tanks, I can just take the railing out, push the equipment to the edge, and instead of essentially, like a lot of wineries, they destem into a container, and then they have to move the container and dump it, which is a whole nother step. It just slows everything down. I thought, why don't I just build a building that just drops down, and I can just put the equipment on wheels, and I'll just. So basically, I redesigned the must pump with essentially a hopper with a little very gentle screw feed that just pushed it 5 feet off the end of the where the crush pad was, and just dropped it in the tank. And it became, it was just, if I'm going to build a new winery, I'm going to do basically three things. I'm going to bottle by gravity, I'm going to receive by gravity, and I'm going to age my barrels in an underground place where they're never touched. Because a lot of wineries had sort of underground. Adelsheim was really the only place that had underground where the barrels sat and didn't get moved. Most people had metal racks that they moved barrels around in. And for me, it was, I never understood the logic behind that. If you had your wine cellar at home, would you ever put your wine cellar on wheeled carts, and every time you wanted to get a bottle of wine, just pull the carts out and get your bottle of wine, then just put them all back in? You would never, that you're not supposed to move wine. So why should you move barrels? It's just aging. It's part of, and it just never made any sense to me. And when I would go to Europe, nobody had metal racks. They were all permanently underground. That's how everyone aged it. So I knew that when I went to Zenith and I was going to build sort of a dream, that I wanted this idea of an underground cellar, that the area underneath the barrels was essentially just had rock between it and the natural dirt that was down there, so the moisture that came through the ground would just come up through the rocks and keep it humidified, and that it would be essentially underground, so I wouldn't have to refrigerate it. And I learned from Adelsheim's mistake, where they built a barrel room, put 5 feet of dirt on it, and then paved a parking lot above it. And they found out that by the end of August, all that heat from the blacktop was radiating all the way down into their barrel room, and they had to cool it. So I was like, well, I'm not putting it below parking lots. So I basically, at Zenith, we put it below the event center, and here we put it below the tasting room, so that there would be no radiant heat, the coming from, so we could keep it cool in the summer. So essentially, it was just trying to take, each place was another step in what can you do. At Zenith, with 4 levels, it was pretty complicated. This place has 2 levels. The way we do the gravity is we essentially just built the crush pad with those railings, but then we made the railings and the spaces big enough that we could just pick a tank up and just put it 11 feet up in the air, put it on the crush pad. Since we rack by nitrogen pressure, it doesn't really care if I'm going up to the same level or going up 11 feet, it still just fills the tank. So we were able to rack by nitrogen without pumping. We were able to take it above the bottling line, and we could bottle by gravity without having another 3rd level, which is what we had done at Zenith. And then the space where we're bottling is as big as a fermentation room, so it was a lot more flexible. So I was able to do those things with a simpler design. And then basically, because we have a storage building, we, instead of storing all that wine in our crush pad, we store it down there. So this is essentially open for the public. So we have tables, and it's just open, and they come down and look. So
how would you describe, you've had a long time making a lot of different kinds of wines, how would you describe your winemaking philosophy? What do you hope people get out of your wine?
Well, the first is that for me, saying you make food wine, which is what, when I started, I was like, I'm making wine to eat with, became like the fad. Everyone's like, well, I make wine for food. I make wine for food. But then I would taste the wines, and it's like, at least my understanding of what wine for food is, this is not what this is. This is kind of American winemaking, which is, and I actually did this for 10 years. It was kind of like, well, you've got these grapes. If they're ripe, you have all this flavor, all this beautiful tannin. You should extract it all, because, gosh, it's gonna, it's all good stuff. So you should get a lot of it. And then when you have a problematic year, you say, well, I don't have very much of this good stuff, but I should probably get it all, so I have some. And it ended up in the same place, that I was just kind of overdoing everything. And that got kind of excessive. And about year 9 or year 8, I was like, this is not what I want to be doing. And then I started really looking about what could be different, and so the idea was always to make wine that was to eat with, which means acidity and balance of flavor. It doesn't mean big fruit and big wood. So those are 2 basic precepts of what I've always done. However, the inherent demand of Pinot Noir for elegance, they talk about Pinot Noir being the iron fist in the velvet glove. You know, it's there, but there is this balance that you're looking for. It isn't I call cheerleader wine, where it's like, here's all my wood and here's all my tan and here's all my color. That's not what Pinot Noir is about. But I didn't really understand that at a really deep level until my 10th vintage. And what happened was in 1998, I decided I needed to go to Europe and go visit winemakers. And I actually went alone for 5 weeks and basically spent 5 weeks visiting wineries in Champagne, Alsace, Burgundy, the Rhone, Piemonte. And in Beaune, actually in Beaune Romanée, in Beaune, with Christine Giebourg, who was the winemaker for Winery Giebourg. I had met her at IPNC a couple years before and said, can I come and visit you? Your wines are fabulous. You have the best wine here. And she said, no, you're wrong. Your wines are fabulous and you have the best wine here. And I was like, thanks, but I know that's not true. I went to visit her and we tasted out of barrels, which is for me way more important than tasting finished wine. It's like when the wine is still really at its most revealing phase. And I was tasting with her and I just had this moment. It was like the only other time, like that first moment when I said I want to be a winemaker. This was the moment I was like, oh, it's about balance. Pinot Noir is about not how much, but how perfect. How you find all of these things that are coming together and you find a way that they all seemingly float around this center of this wine rather than everything's weighed down around the edges. And I came back and I started making fundamentally different. 98 vintage was fundamentally different than anything I'd done before. And it was really interesting because I told this story to my customers and, you know, they would come and visit. And several years later, after I've been doing this for a while and I had wines out from 98, 99, 2000, 2001, 2002, I had a number of really good customers that came and visited me and said, you know, we've watched your wines since the beginning. We always loved your wines. And we're really glad you went to France. And I was like, yeah, me too. You know? So it is hard to describe, but it is this goal of how you put things together. And one of the things that I realized into the 2000s was that part of that complexity that you're looking for in Pinot Noir couldn't just come from barrels and winemaking, but it had to come from grapes. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, when everything started dying of phylloxera, I went on a mission with all the growers that I had to replant with more diversity in higher altitude sections of the vineyards. So more different clones, different rootstocks, but higher altitudes, grapes. You know, it was a big rush to get early ripening clones, which to me doesn't make much sense as it's getting hotter. You need later ripening clones. You need later ripening rootstocks, not earlier. You need to go higher where it's colder and you can build more complexity into wine. So we started replanting with, instead of one or two things, with multiple clones in these vineyards. And as those came into production, I realized that the wood, and oak is, people like oak, really like it. I mean, Matt Kramer has written a lot of articles, and you know, as an editor for Wine Spectator for years, a columnist wrote in one of his books that oak was catnip for humans. Never forgot that. And I realized that if my goal is to make balanced wines that are good to eat with, that tell the story of a place. So if one vineyard's wines taste kind of like another vineyard's wines, how have you really told the story of the place? that the choices that I was making as a winemaker, instead of being directed to make, oh, this tastes really good, needed to be, this tastes really revealing. And then I also came to the belief, and this was partly of my work at Oregon Pinot Camp, and it was called the Style Workshop, that really the idea that there were good and bad vintage was not really, I didn't believe it anymore. I used to say this is a crappy vintage, but I made some pretty good wine. I was like, it's not a crappy vintage, it's a really hard vintage. It was a lot harder to do a good job in this vintage than it was in an easy vintage. And that my wife would always say it's the vintage that separates the men from the boys and the women from the girls. That when nature throws everything in your face, that the best wines will be made from the people that get it. So I then also adopted that the wine shouldn't taste the same from like a hot early vintage, from a cool late vintage, from a vintage where there was more stress of rot to where it was more perfect. Obviously don't want your wines to taste rotten, but there is a thing that happens in those vintages, especially that are cooler and later and more problematic, that gives you a balance that is actually really beautiful in long-term aging. Yeah, they don't show very well when they're young because they didn't taste very good when you picked them. It's not that the flavors weren't there, it's just that they were kind of wound up in all this other stuff that was happening. And with time, what I discovered was that the true terroir